To the NOAA Central Library. I'm Kate Raleigh, the librarian and host, and we're excited to have Dr. Leticia Williams here today. Leticia is a postdoctoral fellow with the NOAA Center for Atmospheric Sciences and Meteorology at Howard University, and is currently contributing to social science research at the National Weather Service in the Operations Division of the Office of Chief Operating Officer. Her research specialization is science communication, which focuses on strengthening public communication and engagement with science. So please join me in welcoming her and her topic, Science Communication at NOAA, Effective Strategies to Increase Public Engagement and Understanding of Science.
All right, hello everyone. We do have a couple of refreshments in the back if anyone would like to help themselves to those. So today I will be discussing what science communication is and how you can use that to increase your engagement with the public and also understanding of science. So we'll be going over a couple of strategies based on science communication research, as well as some informal interviews that I have done with some of your colleagues here at NOAA. So to begin, first, what is communication? So there's several different models of communication, but one of the models that is most useful is the transactional model of communication, which focuses on the exchange of information via verbal communication, so speaking, or nonverbal communication, which could be your body language, images, things of that sort. And so this model is particularly useful because it recognizes the sender and receiver who are engaged in the communication process as equal communicators who are engaged in building mutual understanding. And so this is once again helpful in our understanding of science communication. So what is science communication? It is the communication between professional communicators such as scientists, journalists, or public information officers, and the lay public, so non-science experts. And most commonly, science communication is channeled through newspapers, television, magazines, and the internet. However, the most recent Science and Engineering Indicators report from the National Science Foundation found that people are using the internet more frequently to get their science information as opposed to more traditional methods of media and communication, such as television news, print news, things of that sort. So as we're going through this presentation today, think about what types of communication channels that you feel would be most effective for your own science communication. Now with science communication, there's a couple of different modes that are used to communicate your science with the public. So the first mode is communication to the public. So this is a one-way mode of communication. So you could think of this as a sender sending their information to the audience, the receiver, and that's where the communication ends. The second mode of communication would be communication with the public. So this would be considered dialogic communication, where knowledge sharing is important to that process, so that mutual understanding is built in this mode. And then lastly, we have communication among the public. And so this is the most participatory mode of communication that focuses on co-production of knowledge and also knowledge building. So ideally, if you were going to use any of these modes of communication, you would like to use either communication with the public or communication among the public to have the most effective science communication. So what are some of the goals of science communication? What can you utilize science communication for? First, of course, that dialogic communication. So that's going to help building the audiences or whoever you're communicating with knowledge about the information that you're sharing. There's also educating the public, and there's several components to this. So first, increasing public engagement with science. So just making the science, providing more opportunities to share your research and engage the public with your information and knowledge and resources that you have for them. Also, you want to make sure that one of your goals is providing relevant information. So you want to make sure that any information that you're sharing is valuable for that particular audience and relevant to them. Lastly, a goal of science communication is to enhance the public's ability to evaluate science policy. And there's a couple of examples there. So for example, if there is a bill at Congress going up about pesticides, someone who is involved in agricultural science could help educate that community about that policy so that they could participate in the things in their community. So along with the goals of science communication are the challenges of science communication. And this is also important to be aware of these challenges so that you can develop strategies to overcome any challenges you may have when you are trying to communicate with the public. So of course, one thing to consider is a scientifically illiterate public. And according to the National Science Foundation Science and Engineering Indicators from 2018, America's knowledge of just pure basic scientific facts remains incomplete. However, their level of knowledge has been at a sustained level over the past 2 decades, so it hasn't decreased. Also, the public's interest in science, right, I know that's kind of hard to believe. Also, we have the public's interest in science. So again, that's relatively low, especially if a particular audience or community does not have any needs for scientific information in their community. And then also, journalists' lack of science expertise. So if you are trying to communicate about your information with a journalist to write maybe a news article for a newspaper or for a print magazine, that can be a challenge because most journalists do not have extensive scientific coursework. That's not their area of training. So that can be a challenge. However, with the current evolution of internet, so through social media, that's also one way that you could overcome this challenge by being kind of your own gatekeeper to your research and being a direct outlet or source of information for your audience. So why is science communication important here at NOAA? So of course, it's important to being able to achieve NOAA's mission. And so here I have 4 of the areas from NOAA's strategic goal plan. And of course, a lot of these areas, we want to influence knowledge and decision making. So whichever line office you may be with, you can consider how your information can help achieve these goals to, of course, again, enhance the public science literacy, so enhance their knowledge of scientific information, and then also improve crisis and risk communication, and this is related to decision making. So providing the audience with relevant information that they can use, implement into their daily lives as they're making important decisions that affect them. So these could be decisions related to their health, to their well-being, to their homes, etc. So next, we're going to go through 3 principles that you can utilize to incorporate into your own science communication. And these principles are based on science communication research, and again, the informal interviews that I've conducted with some of your NOAA colleagues. So the first thing asks, who is your audience? So you want to be able to identify your audience, and that could be partners, stakeholders, individuals in your community that you are serving. It could be other scientists, policymakers at the Hill. And so you want to make sure, again, that your information is relevant to your audience and that you are tailoring your information so that it's understandable to your audience. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later. Of course, you want to utilize a user-centered message. So that means that your information, again, is structured so that it benefits that particular audience and focuses on their needs, which you may want to share more information about your research or how you came about your findings and other things. But again, you want to just make sure that information is focused on that audience so that you're not overwhelming them with too much information. And lastly, you want to tailor your communication for your audience. So one trick to do this is by doing an audience analysis, which sometimes may not be possible before you meet your audience. But if you know who your audience is, you can think about the age of your audience, the education level, and other demographic factors that might affect what type of information you're providing. So if I'm giving a presentation to a class of 3rd graders versus a atmospheric science PhD level audience, of course, I'm going to have some flexibility with the type of information I can share. So once again, you just want to tailor your information as best as possible so that it is suitable for that audience. So next we have, I think, yes, an example. And this is from the Delta Airlines safety video. And so how many of us pay attention when you're on a flight and the flight attendant is like showing you the exits and showing you how to use the air mask? I know I've flown several times and like I never pay attention. And I really thought about this when Southwest had their accident where the window burst out and they were instructing the people to put on their air mask, and a lot of people were using them incorrectly. So Delta developed this video to make it more interesting and to gain the audience's attention. So, and of course there's an ad, so I'll keep talking while the ad plays. So again, this is just an example to show you how you can be creative, and here it goes. And they use common memes.
And thanks for flying with Delta. Our first priority on every flight is safety. Okay. Be sure all carry-on items are securely stowed in an overhead bin. And ensure all aisles, exits, and bulkhead areas are clear. For everyone's safety, federal regulations require all passengers to comply with the posted placards and lighted information signs located throughout the cabin, in addition to any crew member instructions. Smoking, including the use of e-cigarettes, is not allowed on any Delta flight. If there's a loss of power and cabin visibility is reduced, lights will illuminate the aisle to guide you to an exit. Please take a moment to find the exits closest to you. And remember, they might be behind you. If necessary, we'll distribute infant life vests or other flotation devices for children who weigh 35 pounds or less. Now, before we take off, be sure your seat is upright, your aisle armrests are lowered, your tray table is put away, and all carry-on items are properly stowed. And finally, now would be a good time for everyone to review the safety information card, which is in your seat pocket.
Everyone loves a cute puppy, right? So this is just another example of how you can kind of be creative with your communication to engage the audience when you might be having difficulty maybe keeping their interest or just even getting them initially interested in your information. Another example of focusing on your audience is this example from the CDC for their disaster preparedness. And they kind of built this around a zombie campaign from the Walking Dead TV show. So if you're interested in that, that could help capture the audience's attention. So they kind of framed everything as what you would do if you were being attacked by a zombie, but then also like specific strategies you can take to prepare. So what things you would need in your disaster preparedness kit, etc. So again, these are just examples of how your communication can focus on a specific audience to try to engage them. So the second principle focuses on the what of your message. So this is the content of your message. So first you want to identify a clear purpose. So you want to identify what your goal is for that particular communication and stick to that as much as possible. In order to do this, something you could do is answer the so what question. So that question of what your take-home message is for that audience. And also this helps you put your message into perspective for your audience. And so again, we're connecting this first principle to the second principle to the first principle by focusing again on our audience and what information is relevant to them. Another strategy you can use to develop your message is the elevator speech approach. So commonly the elevator speech is used to introduce yourself. And the thinking of the elevator speech is that if you met someone, say, on the 15th floor of a building, and we're going down to the first floor, that might take like 20 to 30 seconds maybe. So can you get your information out in that period of time? So this is one way to help you really make sure that your message is concise and succinct and to the point. Other things that you can do to enhance your message is to use everyday language. So this would include metaphors, analogies, also any type of plain language that you can utilize. Also, if you're using larger numbers, you want to try to quantify what those numbers mean. So you want to give the numbers meaning. So a good recent example of this was in coverage of the recent Hawaii volcano eruptions. So a lot of the reporters who were sharing that news story talked about how when it erupted, lava flow covered 116 acres. Well, how much is 116 acres? So they described that as nearly the size of 88 football fields. So 88 football fields sounds a lot more massive than 116 acres. So again, you want to just add meaning to the information you're sharing so that it's more memorable and understandable for your audience. And then also you want to avoid jargon. So avoid that language that your colleagues and peers might understand, but that someone who is a non-science expert may not have any knowledge of. And one tool that I found online that was pretty useful in helping to identify if you have jargon in your language was developed by Zone et al., and I probably just mispronounced that name. But they have a dejargonizer. So what you can do is you can go to their website for their tool. They have a thing where you can search for your content, or you can just copy and paste your content in. I found the easier method is to just copy and paste your information. And then you hit the start button and they'll give you back this report that will give you a readability grade. And it will also highlight in your text words that are easy to know or words that are a little bit more difficult that you might want to take out of your information. So that's one way to help you determine if you have high levels of jargon in your communication. So the third and final strategy is how you will share your information or knowledge with others. So this focuses on how you are going to present your information, what communication channels you might want to use. So you can see here is our communication tree, and we have social media, we have images, different types of tools that you could use to share your information. So when you are focusing on how you're going to share your information, you want to focus on simple messages. So often to help you keep your information concise, you might want to start off with just what are your essential 3 main points, and does that cover your bases for the information that you want to share? Again, so that your audience does not suffer from information overload, where it's so much information they can't focus in on what to actually remember from your information. Also, you want to utilize as many, or not as many, but you want to utilize a different communication approach. So some of the approaches here are visual communication. So when possible, use an image or a graphic to convey your information. And that could be also animations or a video. And consider color variations. So if I had something to communicate risk, some colors that I might use would be red, yellow, and green, because we associate that with our stoplight system. So red usually means stop, yellow means caution. So that's something that the audience would be familiar with. Also, if you are using visual communication and you have a legend, you want to make sure that it's easy for the audience to interpret what your legend means, whether that's numerical distances for feet or amounts of precipitation, or if you have a text description for your legend. So the other strategy that you could use is storytelling. So this might be a little bit more challenging, but it's a great way for scientists to communicate your research and to also communicate what makes you passionate about your research. So storytelling focuses on characters, a plot. It can include an obstacle or a problem, and then also the resolution. So sometimes it's easier for the audience to remember the information if it's communicated in the form of a story, because instead of remembering those specific details, they can remember the story to help them keep everything contained in their memory. So again, visual communication and narratives are some of the ways that you can share your information with others. And then lastly, think about training and opportunities that you have so that you can become the best science communicator that you can be. So those could include media training if you're going to be doing interviews for television or print news. And then it could also include communication training to help you develop strategies on how you want to communicate with the public. So this is actually an example from Time magazine. And this was a story about the boys who were trapped in the cave in Thailand. So, and it might be difficult to see from the back of the room, but right in this area, they had a legend. And this is kind of the path that they had to go through to rescue the boys. So it gave more meaning to the actual print story in terms of the challenges that the rescue team had and what they had to do in order to rescue the boys from the cave. So is your science communication effective? So of course, things to consider when you're creating your communication plan. And a communication plan is just simply your strategy that you want to use when you're going to be communicating with a particular audience. So you can ask yourself the who, what, and how questions to see if you have the answers for that and what strategies you want to utilize. And then another good test is the grandmother test. Is anyone familiar with this? So great. So basically, if you had to ask, or if you had to tell your grandmother about your research or the information you're planning on sharing, would she be able to understand it? So that's one great way to really make sure that your information is broken down in a way that makes it understandable for the audience. And so a couple of quick quotes I wanted to share with you about how your colleagues are using these strategies in their own science communication. So going back to the importance of identifying the audience, one of your colleagues said, I try to keep it simple and relatable to the audience I'm talking to, whether it's school-aged kids or an elderly community, such as senior citizens, because I want to make sure that I'm able to reach that audience. So again, really focusing on who you're communicating with and how that information is important to their lives. In terms of the types of language that you use, another of your colleagues said, I like to simplify conceptual models into plain language so that when I am sharing my information, it's not a foreign language to the audience. So really taking the time to consider the language that you're using and how something that may be common to you since you've studied this since you were maybe an undergrad may not be so common to someone that you're speaking with. Another perspective from one of your colleagues was about storytelling, which is probably, again, one of the more challenging methods to use for science communication. So if you do find yourself maybe at the first time after you try storytelling and you don't think it went as best as you would have hoped for, I encourage you all to keep practicing because one of your colleagues said storytelling is key. It's a big part of my world. It's the key to getting information across, to making things relevant, to meeting people where they are. So again, this can be a very effective communication strategy for you to utilize. So lastly, what are some resources that are here at NOAA that you can utilize? So each communications office for your line office, I would encourage you to reach out to them if you're ever conducting any type of interviews or anything like that. I know the National Weather Service has a person who actually offers media training for NOAA scientists, so that's a great resource for you to utilize. Also, COMPAS, which is the Communication Partnership for Science and the Sea, offers a message box workbook, which will help you identify your audience and then go through several steps to tailor your message in a way that's effective for that audience. And COMPAS was actually co-founded by Dr. Jane Leticia, who was a former NOAA administrator from 2009 to 2013. So her organization is just a great, I recommend all of you to go and look at that organization to see what they offer. Also, NOAA, they have a lot of information about science communication as well, and resources that are available to you all. And then lastly, the dejargonizer tool. So in acknowledgement, I'd like to thank the NOAA EPP program for sponsoring the NOAA Center for Atmospheric Sciences and Meteorology that funds all the research and work that I do. And now we will have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. Do we have any questions in the room?
I actually have a question. Hi, Dr. Williams. Thank you for your presentation. It's very informative.
Thank you.
On one of your earlier slides, you mentioned there were three ways in which we present information to the public. And the first two you suggested were more appropriate. The last two, you suggested were more appropriate in terms, which was just a display communication. Can you explain a little bit about why that one is not preferred? I mean, we are group of scientists and we like to share our findings and our research. So what would be problematic with that one versus the other two?
Right, so and I can go back, yeah. Oops. There it is. So this communication, oh yes, I'll repeat her question. So the question was, why are the communication with the public and communication among the public more preferable than communication to the public? So communication to the public is that one-way communication. So it's more of a linear process where the sender sends the information to the receiver, to the audience, and that's it for the communication process. So you can think of it as you're basically dumping information into the audience. And this reflects one of the earlier models of science communication, which was the knowledge deficit model. So with this model, we consider that the audience is still scientifically illiterate, even though we're able to provide them with that information in this one-way mode of communication. And so when you're looking at why the audience is still scientifically illiterate, there's really no way to ascertain why they're still unable to grasp that knowledge, because in theory, you're providing the information, so they should be able to understand it and grasp whatever information you're sharing. However, research has shown that's not effective, and that even if information is being shared with someone, they may not still be able to understand it. So that's why the other two models are more valuable, because in these models where you're communicating with the public or among the public, there's that opportunity to build that mutual understanding where someone can ask for clarification or indicate that they're not understanding something, and then you can provide additional information with them as you are both trying to build that knowledge together.
We have one more question.
Can you please specifically speak a little bit more about what you're doing for the Weather Service?
Sure. So, oh yes, so I forget. So the question was if I could speak about what I'm doing here with the Weather Service. So I am assisting in social science research. My area of study is science communication. So working on projects with our impact decision-based support services, and how we can use different communication channels such as social media to enhance those services. Also, I have a project going on looking at service assessments that the National Weather Service has done, and how social science was valuable to those projects because social science allows us to study the human dimensions of something. So for example, with Hurricane Harvey, if there was someone who did not evacuate, through social science research, we could study what particular behaviors influence their decision not to evacuate. And then my other area of research looks at STEM diversity and how communication can be used to increase STEM diversity intervention strategies for minorities in STEM.
We have a few questions online. I'm going to hop between the audience and online. Okay. First question was, could the Delta airline example miss the mark on effective communication? It seems the audiences would be more concerned with spotting their favorite memes. And what are some tips on avoiding including too much stimulus or entertainment?
Right. So that's kind of the line that you have to try to balance between making sure that your information is going to gain the audience's attention and then being overstimulating. So I think this would also be a good example of it might depend on the person in the audience. So for example, my mom, who is not familiar with these memes from social media, might be distracted by that because she would be trying to figure out like what's going on. So this would definitely be more for a passenger who's familiar with social media, etc. In terms of overstimulation, I don't think it would be too overstimulating. So in the Delta actual video, there's no captions on the bottom giving you the subtitles, so you're not trying to read as it's going along. So you would just be watching the video.
We have a question in the room.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
One challenge I've experienced with science and communication is communicating uncertainty and probability, things like that. Something you're probably very familiar with from the one you serve. So I was just wondering if you had any kind of tips or resources that kind of help.
Yeah, so the question was about how to effectively communicate uncertainty and probability. I know this is one area that the Weather Service is kind of moving towards. So my research doesn't particularly focus on that, but there are a lot of resources about communicating uncertainty and probability and how that can be most effective. So I can get your email and send you some of those resources as well. But in general, there's been, I would say, a balance of research when looking at probability of whether it's effective or not. And one thing to consider would again be, what is the public's understanding of probability? So are they able to understand what it means if you say there's a 30% chance of rain? And I think that would be the place to start when you're really thinking about those types of communication.
I have a comment to follow on to that, and it was just locally with the Ellicott City flooding, which was originally thought to be a 500 to 1,000 year probability flood, one in 500 to 1 in 1,000. And we had 2 of those in 2 years. So it's also the challenge of explaining to the public how what was a probability a few years ago is no longer valid because of the changing climate. So it's just an example of the evolution of information we feed to the public and why that's confusing to the public.
Yeah.
You know, and there's an inherent confusion when you start talking about probabilities of 500-year floods and 1,000-year floods.
Right.
With a radically changing climate. It's just a comment on it.
No, that's a perfect example of how probabilities, although they may be useful, may be confusing to the public, and they may not even know what those numbers mean. And so, although we have those probabilities as well, it could be useful to kind of put that into simple layman's terms of what that means for that community.
We have a few more questions online. This one is relating to what you've just been saying, but do you have any further tips for effective storytelling?
Yes, so for effective storytelling, and there's a couple of different resources online as well that you can refer to, but I know one resource that I found that was particularly interesting was thinking of your storytelling as a children's animated film. So like a Disney film where there's a protagonist, there's a story. Usually about 3/4 through the story, there will be like a moment in the film where something big happens, and then by the end of the film, it's resolved with solutions. So you can kind of think of what characters you might be able to develop in your storytelling, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like a person for your character. It could be climate, for example, could be one of your characters in your story. And then your plot would be the scenario or context that you're discussing. So if we go back to the Ellicott City example, that would be a great example to develop a narrative about in terms of the flood history in that community, what were some of the scenarios that occurred, and then what was ultimately happening with that. So yeah, you want to think of it as a general story as you're developing the components that you want to include. And storytelling is also a great way to humanize your research and make it less, the word I'm trying to think of, make it less intimidating for the audience. Mm-hmm.
So a quick question about, I know you spent some time at like the AMS, right, going to presentations. Is there any one particular thing that you would tell, a scientist, that comes from academia or from NOAA? What's like the one thing that really sticks out to you in terms of their communication style that you would say, hey, if you guys could change this one thing, what would that actually be?
That's a good question. So the question was if I could recommend one thing to change for scientists when they're at a conference such as AMS or giving a presentation, what would that be? And again, AMS or even academic conferences are a little different because your peers might know your language there. But I think in general, it would just be focusing on the language. And so if you are in a room with a non-science community, so even myself sometimes, like my training isn't in science. And so if I go to a presentation, I'll be making my list of things to like go and ask the speaker after, or terms to look up so I can have a thorough understanding of what they're trying to communicate. So really trying to find the most simple way to structure your information so that no matter who is in your audience or whoever is in your audience, if they can really understand your information, because all the research that you do is very important. And so I think the ultimate goal should be that you're allowing your research to reach as many people as possible.
To follow that up online, we have a question related. So how would you give any specific tips for achieving that balance between simplifying for the layman and then maintaining your science audience?
Yes, so that's also something that's very strict, not strict, but difficult to do in terms of you don't want to dumb down your science. So one of your colleagues that I spoke to here at NOAA just talked about simplifying conceptual models. So trying to maintain the integrity of your research, but just finding a simple way to communicate it. So trying to take the foreign language out of what you're communicating so that it's understandable for your audience. And I always tell people, but with any type of communication you're doing, the best thing you can do for yourself is just to continue practicing. And the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. So whether you're presenting your research at academic conferences, whether you have a couple colleagues here at NOAA who you all have a communication support group where you can kind of practice in front of each other, or if you're just at home practicing in front of your mirror, that's another great way to kind of take the stress off of preparing yourself to communicate. And you can just record yourself with your tablet or your iPhone and go through a couple of rounds of the information that you'll be sharing to really get yourself comfortable to sharing your information, to hearing yourself speak out loud, and to just be comfortable with the actual communication process.
A few more questions online. How can scientists, people at NOAA, how can they best assess what the audience does and does not know? Are there any surveys of public knowledge out there about scientific concepts?
So the best indicators of scientific knowledge that I found are from the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators. And I believe they do have a breakdown for specific science topics as well. However, I think it would just be really gauging your audience. So being able to know who's in your audience, and that might be challenging if it's your first time speaking to that audience. But if it's an audience in a community that you've spoken to a few times and you know that community, that could help with identifying your audience. And then another thing I would recommend doing is if you are going somewhere to give a talk or a presentation, you could reach out to the coordinator and ask them if they have 5 minutes to have a brief conversation with you about the audience, if they know particular things that are effective with that audience, so then you can incorporate that into your communication as well.
One more question that I noticed, and it hops back a little bit. How does the transactional model you introduced earlier relate to the other interactions, the to, with, and among the public?
Right. Oops. Yes. So the transactional model of communication. So you can see here that between the communicators, we have the encoding and decoding process, which is basically you encode a message when you are sending it to your audience, and then the audience decodes that message. So they make sense of that message based on their knowledge of the particular meaning that they have attached to that message. And then it's sent on a communication channel. So here you can see that between the communicators encoding and decoding, there's arrows on both sides of that communication channel, meaning that it's not, the meaning is not, so meaning that the sender or the receiver is not responsible for that encoding or decoding process. They're working together. So there's always communication occurring, whether it's verbal or nonverbal communication. They're both equal participants in that communication process. So you can think of yourself as being one of the communicators, your audience as the other communicator, and that you're always engaged in a communication process with them where you're both simultaneously, so at the same time, encoding and decoding messages to make sure that there is that meaning that's being established. So even when you are giving a presentation or you're involved in any type of science communication, you can kind of look at the audience for those nonverbal cues, those behavioral signals that they either do understand the information you're sharing, or it might be a little confusing for them. So you might think see those blank stares where you can tell people are thinking, or have those confused faces on their looks. And so yeah, so that's how the transactional model would connect to the communicating with the public and then among the public.
We did have a few other questions just related to your resources, where to find them.
Mm-hmm.
A few questions about what Compass was, if you just Googled it, what would.
Yeah, so if you, again, so Compass is, I have the acronym here. The Communication Partnership for Science and Sea. So they, again, focus on effective science communication. So if you Google Compass, their website should pop up. And again, their message box workbook is a great resource to really help you go through several steps to develop whatever message you want to have for your science communication. For NOAA Communications, if you Google actually NOAA Communications, it will give you different contacts for the different line offices. So you could just contact that main person in their office and they would be able to direct you to who you can communicate for that. For AAAS, they have on their website information about communication as well as public engagement. And so you can look there for strategies about effective science communication. And then that is the website for the de-jargonizer tool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This presentation will be on the library's YouTube channel. The slides will be available, and course, you can always reach out to
Yes.
Dr. Williams, I'm sure.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you
All right,
so much.
thank you all.